Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
I'm with Aatish Taseer, this author of several books of fiction and non-fiction, and we're sitting in this beautiful house in the heart of Delhi.
It's my grandmother's house.
Okay. But the point is that this is the heart of Lachin's India, and yet you had a comment on your Twitter timeline where you talked about the Khan Market gang. It's somewhat ironical, isn't it, that you're living within spitting distance of Khan Market and being critical about people like us?
Well, it was firstly it was half a joke, but there was a seriousness underneath it, which was that obviously I did grow up here, and my grandmother's father was part of the building of this city, and Khan Market was the local market where you got your fruit and vegetables. And my grandfather, till his dying day, would find it ridiculous if someone said they were going to have dinner or lunch in Khan Market, because he'd never known that there had been ever restaurants or anything like that. So I was laughing, but I was laughing because it had become also this symbol of a kind of like of wealth, of a sort of a Bastille almost, you know. And you have somebody
You're storming the Bastille.
You have somebody like Ram Madhav having the election party after Modi's second victory in town hall, and you think,
which is a restaurant in Khan Market.
Which is a restaurant in Khan Market, and you just think, well, what is the symbolism they're trying to express?
So what is the symbolism?
Well, what worries me?
And what's wrong with having a party in town hall?
Well, nothing. But why make a spectacle of it? What are you saying? And I'll tell you what I think they're saying, and what worries me is that I've always seen this as a war on two fronts. There are, of course, the Muslims who will be done down, who will be part of a kind of campaign of demonization. But the real war, the much more significant war, is against India's English-speaking elite. And I feel like...
And you're both. You're Muslim, or at least half Muslim, well, and you're very much a part of India's English-speaking
I belong to some of those things, but this is not personal. What worries me is that, and I thought about this today, there's a very nice moment in Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism where she says, she's quoting Tocqueville, and she says that the French nobility were never so much despised as when they had lost political power but still retained economic power. That it was then that like the real violence against them kind of came to the fore. And what worries me right now is that this old Indian English speaking elite, which is also, by the way,
which has lost political power,
has been politically vanquished. And I feel when I speak to businessmen, when I speak to people in India, that a kind of ruin is about to befall them, and that Modi is going to
feel that.
Yeah, absolutely. Businessmen, I have never heard one said to me, and they always speak in confidence because they're nervous, he was like, he wants to destroy us all.
Businessmen speaking in confidence because they're nervous to you.
Because businessmen in India typically are afraid to speak out. I mean, this lovely example we have just now with Zomato is so wonderful, because in America where I live, for instance, the power of corporate culture to affect change is amazing. Whenever someone in North Carolina or Alabama affects a bad law, companies are like, we're going to pull out, and they change their mind. And so this is a very rare example of corporate culture here taking a stand. But typically businessmen are very afraid because they have been targets of the state. And
so what did this guy say to you? I'm assuming it's a guy.
He said to me, he said he would like to have one or two oligarchs around him who he can control, modeling himself around like people like Xi and Putin.
Who, the Prime Minister likes to have a couple of oligarchs.
Yeah, but for the rest of us, he means us total harm. And you know, when you see what is happening with the Indian economy...
But hang on a second. Sure. This particular guy who probably
is not... This is not just one guy.
Okay, sure. Maybe 2 or 3 or 4 people that you're speaking to presumably are not 1 or 2 of those oligarchs who the Prime Minister likes to have around. So, I mean, I would say that if you're not inside the Lakshman Rekha and you're outside, and, you know...
I don't think that
should...
No, but there shouldn't... If businessmen are afraid, it depends on what your politics are. If you believe in Chavezian politics, yes, lovely, devastate business, go on, you know, build toilets, give gas cylinders, devastate
Nothing
business.
wrong with building toilets in a country where there are no toilets
at all. And at the same time, no country has ever become a great country simply by building toilets.
Obviously.
If you believe that economic upliftment comes in the way that we've seen it come to Southeast Asia, in the way that we've seen it come to China, if you believe in those things, then you cannot devastate business. Businessmen are being hounded. We are speaking today on a day when a man has been demonized to this extent, where we have a suicide of a businessman.
You're talking about the cafe coffee day owner, Mr. Siddhartha.
Absolutely. Okay. So we're not making this up.
No, you're not. Listen, I'm not accusing you of making any of it up. All I'm saying is that this is perhaps a one side, well, there's one point of view, and that you have to look at, of course, but you have to look at.
This is not the gospel of.
No, obviously not.
For myself,
but Aatish, of course you are, and the reason I'm here talking to you is because you are a perceptive observer of India. You've written several books, both fiction and non-fiction, which is why we are here.
Right.
So for you to say that, for you not to acknowledge that the Prime Minister may be doing some other things, which is perhaps
he's doing. I don't subscribe to that ideology. If you are a socialist, then you would be very happy with the performance of the Prime Minister. I am not a socialist. I do not believe that growth happens that way.
But is that why you called him, or not? You didn't call him. Is that why Time Magazine, for which you wrote, called him divider in chief during the election?
Firstly, obviously, you know that no writer chooses his headlines, but I think they called him the divider in chief because he uses divisiveness to kind of consolidate his base, and he targets certain people, and he gives dog whistles, and he encourages an atmosphere that has brought forth some of the ugliest violence we've seen in India in years.
So it's not as if India is not familiar with violence at an enormous scale. So A, what is Modi ji doing that is different, and B, why isn't it that people like you and me, or maybe not me, okay, why isn't it that the chattering classes who also have power are not able to speak out? That's, I think,
so two things. Firstly, what you refer to is absolutely right, and every society has depths of violence, of hatred, of prejudice within it. In India, in my lifetime, I was born in 1980. We had the 1984 riots, which was some of my earliest memories. We went into Babri Masjid, and we started to see through the 90s what I thought was an upward arc. We saw economic development, we saw the coming into being of a new kind of Indian, we saw those concerns, that kind of like tribalism start to get less, and people start to hope for a new kind of world, a world that has come into being in parts of Asia, in parts of Europe, in parts. It's not as if it's an illusory world. It's a world where people put aspiration, economic hope, those things before they put their tribalisms. And one of the reasons that I was a supporter of Mr. Modi in 2014, even though I was suspicious
of... You were a supporter of Modi in 2014?
Yeah, and one of the reasons, or I was hopeful about what he would do, was that I thought that if he brought a time of economic prosperity, then even regardless of what was in his heart, that a time would come into being in India where people would set those things aside, because actually when you're on that road to becoming a place like South Korea, let's say, it's not really possible to also have all the ugly stuff.
But you don't want to be compared to South Korea, for crying out loud.
South Korea has had a wonderfully successful story economically. It's a country that has...
But how can you compare India with South Korea, which is...
I'm not comparing, Jyoti, I'm simply saying that this is a country that's achieved a standard of... That standard of living to some extent. China has made huge leaps, Japan has made huge leaps, Southeast Asia has made huge leaps. If you're not going to look at your direct neighbors, like, who are you going to look at? You have every reason to think that parts of India would start to look and feel and move in that direction economically. And my feeling was always that if the Prime Minister was to engender that atmosphere, that India's tribalisms would subside. But he in fact has followed what feels almost like Chavezian populism. Very, very socialistic, very statist, and simultaneously he's done this other thing where he's encouraged hate, he's encouraged tribalisms. And so 5 years on, it feels like the bleakest moment in my arc of being associated with India. In the time that I've seen, it's not that there were not worse days.
Sure.
It was that the arc was like this, and suddenly there's a backward
Yeah, but
movement.
listen, I'm saying that the Indian experience is one of violence and caste hatred, and you've written about it yourself in your several books. But my question to you is also about Lachin's Delhi, the Khan Market gang that the Prime Minister very disparagingly uses that term. This could be applied to you as well.
I have very severely written about the isolation of the English elite. It could almost be argued that every one of my books was about the isolation of that
And
elite.
so you would agree with what the Prime Minister says?
Don't remember that I've seen that elite not only here, but in an even more pernicious form in Pakistan. And I felt that those people, because of their isolation, because of their contempt for Indian culture, for Indian language, for their total inability to see that they were standing in what was kind of an oppressive relationship to the rest of the country, were people singled out for destruction, for doom. So that those two things can go together. That criticism of what the English elite was can be made, and we can also feel that what's come in its place is not a good thing.
Absolutely, but then on this particular thing, you and the Prime Minister probably agree.
I think what you're asking me is there a certain kind of inevitability about the advent of Modi? Yes, there is.
When people who for 60 or 70 years after independence lived very well and were close to the political powers that be. And now when they're not, they're complaining.
I don't think that, I'm not concerned that much about them. I mean, if ruin is to come to them, and we think that it was deserved, let them be ruined. I'm concerned about the country that's coming into being.
But there one thing that you would agree is that the language of communication is closer to the people that they govern.
Absolutely. I mean, do they have a claim on authenticity? Of course they have a claim on authenticity. Do they
so that is perhaps what rings true. When you vote in across the North Indian heartland.
I mean, you're talking to a man who called Rahul Gandhi an unteachable mediocrity, and I stand by that. And every one of my books has been very fearful about that degree by degree. If you track an arc from, let's say, Nehru to Rahul Gandhi, in almost every Indian family, you'll see at that generation a relationship with tradition, a relationship with with language, with culture, and then almost everyone of about my mother's generation is sent to a kind of convent school and a school like the Doon School, where they experience a sort of cultural denuding. And that leaves them without the means to deal with their country. We're talking about a country like England. Look how or the fact that the English elite can still produce prime ministers, can still engage in public life, and here we are running for our lives.
Right. But perhaps that's what the Prime Minister is tapping into, is this cultural dislocation that the elite is now synonymous with.
It's true. I'm completely convinced that is what he's tapping into, but what is he bringing into being? Because also one of the discoveries of the Twice Born that was very powerful for me, which is my most recent book, was that I went feeling that I was deracinated, that I was part of this kind of English-speaking elite that had lost culture. But one of the things that I discovered was that among the most grounded Brahmin boys who literally were living in Varanasi, learning the Ved, learning Sanskrit, that a similar process that had occurred in my life was occurring among them too. They were also losing tradition, losing culture in much more haphazard ways. But they were not part of an intact past. The past was falling away from them too. And they were living with a sense of that loss. And that loss, or that energy that was leaving the edifice of tradition, was being channeled or redirected into this politics of revival, into this politics of Hindutva. And that cycle is not a good cycle. It's a cycle that leads you nowhere.
So earlier in our conversation, you talked about Pakistan, how you were quite taken with the fact that Imran Khan, the Prime Minister, sacked a member of his government for saying horrible things about Hindus.
Right.
Why are you so surprised?
Why am I surprised that he did it?
Yeah.
I'm always surprised when Pakistan does something more decent than India.
But
I don't see these countries as symmetrical. I see us as the shining hope for democracy and decency and for secularism. And when they don't even have a substantial Hindu minority, and when somebody like Imran Khan can take a stand like that, and Prime Minister Modi is encouraging all his loonies to go to keep speaking.
Imran Khan is hardly, I mean, he is an elected Prime Minister, but he's hardly a real politician. And he's completely controlled by his own army.
And actually something even more important is that Modi represents real democratic change, whereas Imran Khan is still part of a drawing room elite.
He's somebody guessing at the passions of people that he doesn't actually represent. So he's been thrown up to manage a kind of passion or an emotion that is very similar to what's going on in India, but he's not an authentic representative of that. And the elite, he in fact belongs to an elite far grander and far more like sort of privileged than the one he's attacking.
But, you know,
I mean, this is somebody who's like at home in like, you know, the best drawing rooms of Europe. And so
it's also interesting that your own father, the Pakistani politician Salman Taseer, who was assassinated because he stood up for the rights of a Christian woman, Asia Bibi. What do people say about that today?
I mean,
Because you've just been there recently.
you know, people, those 5 people that they call civil society in Pakistan are full of like regard and love for him. The West is full of regard and love for him. But on the streets of Pakistan, it's the killer of my father who's the hero. There's a mazar in Islamabad where people come and worship the killer.
And put flowers at the mazar.
When you go through the streets of Lahore, you'll see a little poster saying, "I am Qadri." And so, I mean, what are we to say of a situation like that? He certainly sacrificed, he certainly did something very brave. But was he bringing meaningful change to his country or society? I don't know if he was.
And Prime Minister Modi, an elected Prime Minister, back with a huge mandate, is bringing democratic change to the country.
He is he's certainly a symptom of class movement. I mean, the advent of a man like Modi is something very moving if you believe in democracy. But the question is, does he believe in democracy? Is he thrown up by the system only to impair it, only to hurt it, only to rule as an authoritarian? I don't really know the answer to that, or maybe I do. But you know, so yeah, but certainly, like, I mean, that was one of the reasons that I was so hopeful about him in 2014, is that side of India where you see a democracy being vital, throwing up people who you couldn't have imagined. That's what democracies are meant to do. But right now, we have a very sterile moment. We have a moment where we almost feel like a single party state. We have the collapse of an opposition. We have a pliable, compliant media. And so India feels less boisterous than it's felt in the past. It feels less like that push and pull that gives democracy its energy, that gives people alternatives. That feels missing.
On this note, Aatish Taseer, thank you so much for speaking to The Print.
Thank you so much for speaking to me, Jyoti. Thank you.
Please continue to watch our YouTube channel. It's live and buzzing.